Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the mysterious world of the first humans, those brave souls who faced an unforgiving world and somehow found meaning in it all. They didn't have smartphones, social media, or even Wi-Fi, but they did have something powerful: belief. Imagine living in a time when every shadow could hide a spirit, and every crack in the earth could be a gateway to another world. Yeah, that's the reality they lived in. You probably wouldn't survive this. So take a moment to appreciate the wonders of modern life before we head back in time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below with your location and the local time, just in case you feel like sharing the vibes of your spot with the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the first humans. Those early adventurers who were more concerned with survival than the abstract mysteries of life. They spent their days learning how to stay alive, all while grappling with their very real fear of the unknown. And in the quiet of the night, as they huddled around a fire, they began to seek explanations. Why did the weather change so suddenly? What caused the thunderous roar of the sky? Was there someone or something behind it all? The first humans didn't have science to back up their questions. What they had were their senses and their imagination. Nature was vast, terrifying, and unfathomable, and so they turned to belief. Because in a world so unpredictable, the idea that there was some kind of guiding force gave them a bit of comfort. The wind, the sun, the rain. These weren't just forces of nature, they were powerful, unseen entities. It made sense, didn't it? The sun gave life, and without it there was nothing. Maybe it had a spirit inside, an ancient god perhaps? If they could understand that spirit, maybe they could predict the next storm. Or maybe even control it. The first humans believed in many things that we'd probably laugh at today, but we have to understand those beliefs were survival tools, shaped by the reality they lived in. Without the comforts of modern life, their imaginations had to work overtime to fill in the gaps. And so their world wasn't just physical, it was magical, with forces that went beyond the visible. There were spirits in the trees, gods in the rocks, and magic in the wind. And every decision, whether to hunt, gather, or take shelter, was influenced by what they believed these forces were trying to tell them. Historians still argue whether these early beliefs were a form of proto-religion, or if they were simply primitive attempts at explaining the chaos of the world. Whatever the case, they were the first steps in a long journey of human understanding, and they were deeply connected to the earth itself. As the first humans settled into their new lives, something fascinating began to happen. Their beliefs began to evolve, not just in response to nature, but also in relation to themselves. You see, they didn't just live in the world, they were part of it. And this new understanding shaped everything they believed. Nature wasn't just something they survived, it was something they were intrinsically linked to. And when it came to the world around them, everything had meaning, even if they couldn't always explain why. The sun, for example, wasn't just a giant ball of fire hanging in the sky. It was a divine being, one that could be coaxed or angered depending on how humans treated the earth. The moon, too, was a god in its own right. Its phases dictated everything from the best times to hunt to the timing of rituals that were supposed to ensure prosperity. And if the moon had power over the tides and cycles of life, then surely there were other forces, unseen and just as powerful, that controlled other aspects of their existence. But even more interesting was the way humans began to see themselves in this complex web of interconnected forces. In early societies, the concept of spirits or gods didn't just mean beings that were out there somewhere. It meant that these forces existed in everything. In every tree, every rock, and every river. You could walk through a forest and find not just trees, but spirits watching over you. You could cross a river and feel its divine presence. Every part of nature had its own spirit, and the human being too was a part of that system, connected to everything around them. At this point, it wasn't just the natural world that was being personified. It was also the very concept of ancestors. Early humans believed in the power of their forebears who, though gone, still had influence over their lives. Ancestors didn't just live in the past. They lived in the present too, guiding the living with their wisdom. This belief in ancestral spirits meant that people felt they weren't entirely alone in the world. They could look to the spirits of their family members for guidance. They didn't have to navigate the world on their own. They had an invisible but powerful network of support that extended through time. Historians still debate whether this form of ancestor worship was a universal practice across early human cultures, or if it developed independently in different regions. But one thing is clear. The idea of invisible forces guiding humanity's destiny was deeply ingrained in early human consciousness. These spirits were seen as protectors and guides, bringing wisdom, warning of danger, and ensuring that families thrived. So it was no wonder that early humans developed rituals to honor their ancestors, often making offerings to them in the hopes of securing their favor. These early beliefs in spirits, gods, and ancestors helped explain the mysteries of life and death, and gave the first humans the strength to face the harsh world around them. Nature wasn't something to fear, no. It was something to understand, to coexist with. If they could align themselves with the rhythms of the earth, perhaps they could unlock its deeper secrets. And that's exactly what they tried to do. As the first humans continued to make sense of the world around them, a deeper, more complex spiritual system began to take shape. It wasn't just about appeasing nature's spirits anymore. Now, people started believing in more direct communication with these forces, especially through the shaman. Shamans were the spiritual mediators, intercessors who could enter a trance-like state to bridge the divide between the human and the divine. These individuals were often revered as possessing special abilities, a deep connection to the spiritual world that allowed them to interpret the messages of gods, ancestors, and spirits. When you think about it, being a shaman wasn't just a job, it was a calling. Shamans were not only healers and ritual leaders, but also seers, capable of journeying to the world beyond the physical. Imagine being the person in the tribe who could speak directly with the spirit world. Talk about pressure. But for early humans, this wasn't some fanciful notion. It was a vital part of survival. Shamans were consulted during times of sickness, before hunting trips, and during times of war to ensure that the gods favored them. In these moments of crisis, the line between life and death seemed thinner, and these mystical practices provided a sense of control. The rituals involved in these spiritual journeys were intense. Shamans might dance, chant, or even ingest special plants to help induce their trance. The belief was that during these altered states of consciousness, the shaman could communicate with spirits, gods, or the very earth itself. In their trance-like states, they would receive visions or messages, and they would share these with their people, interpreting what they meant for the tribe's well-being. Some of these visions were described as encounters with animals, which the shamans believed embodied the spirits of the earth. Other visions might reveal events yet to come, guiding the community in their decisions. But here's the kicker. Historians still argue whether shamanism was simply a form of early psychology, a way for people to process trauma, fear, and life's uncertainties, or if it was a true spiritual experience. Some scholars suggest that shamans, through their deep trance states, might have had access to a kind of altered perception, which allowed them to think outside the box or process information in unique ways. Perhaps they weren't just talking to spirits, but interpreting their surroundings and the human condition in ways that others couldn't. Regardless of whether the spiritual connection was real or psychological, it played a central role in the early belief systems that shaped human culture. And, in case you're wondering, the importance of shamans wasn't limited to small groups of people. As societies evolved and became more structured, the role of the shaman didn't disappear. In fact, it grew. Shamans became priests, kings, and even advisors, their influence stretching far beyond the confines of early communities. These early beliefs and practices, once linked to survival, evolved into something more complex, a system that intertwined the spiritual with the physical, the personal with the collective. The connection between humans and spirits wasn't just about appeasement anymore. It was about understanding, partnership, and communication. And as human societies grew, this belief system laid the foundation for the pantheons and religious structures we recognize today. But in those early days, when the earth felt endless and dangerous, belief in the power of the shaman was a guiding light in the dark. As human societies grew more complex, their beliefs and practices followed suit. No longer were humans just worried about appeasing the elements or communicating with spirits through shamans. Now they started trying to understand the forces around them in a more structured way. This shift eventually led to one of the most fascinating developments in early human culture, the creation of symbols and art that served as more than just decoration. These images weren't just pretty pictures. They were powerful spiritual tools. One of the most famous examples of this is the cave paintings. Picture this. Early humans, hunched over in the dim light of a flickering fire, painting on the walls of caves, sometimes in places so remote they were never meant to be seen by anyone else. These paintings weren't just random doodles. They were thought to be part of a larger spiritual ritual, aimed at connecting with supernatural forces. The images of animals, particularly those of hunting prey like bison, horses, and mammoths, might have been created to ensure success in the hunt. Some researchers suggest that by depicting the animal, early humans believed they could spiritually control or call upon the spirit of that animal to help them succeed in their hunt. This wasn't just an art form, it was a tool of survival. Imagine the first humans, painting in the flickering shadows of the cave, trying to draw the power of these animals into their world. In doing so, they created a kind of spiritual connection to their prey, an intimate bond that blurred the lines between the physical world and the supernatural. It's almost like their art was a direct extension of their belief system, as if they could reach out and touch the spirit world through their hands. Historians still debate the exact purpose of cave art. Was it a form of communication, a kind of ancient storytelling? Or was it purely spiritual, a means to communicate with unseen forces? Some believe it was a combination of both. After all, humans have always had a need to tell stories, whether about their adventures, their ancestors, or their encounters with the divine. Cave paintings may have been an early form of narrative, one that connected them not only to the earth but to each other, communicating shared beliefs and stories across generation. But the role of symbols wasn't limited to just art. Early humans also began to use symbols in other aspects of life, from carving sacred objects to using totems. A totem, often an animal or natural element, represented a person's connection to a particular spirit or ancestor. If a person's totem was the eagle, for example, they might believe they were imbued with the eagle's qualities, strength, vision, or freedom. These totems became a way of identifying with the divine, as if these animals or elements held the keys to understanding the world. These symbols were powerful, so powerful, in fact, that they became the foundation for much of the religious iconography that we see in later cultures. In many ways, these early images and symbols were the roots from which all religious systems would eventually grow. From the gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt to the deities of Mesopotamia, the use of symbols to represent the divine became a staple of human belief systems across the globe. And while we look at these early practices and think of them as primitive or superstitious, they were far from it. They were deeply integrated into the way people understood themselves and their place in the world. These symbols weren't just decorations. They were spiritual anchors, each one tied to a force greater than the self, and each one a reminder that humanity was never alone in the world. As human societies continued to develop, so did their spiritual understanding, which took shape through the formation of even more complex belief systems. And these belief systems weren't just about the physical world around them anymore. They extended far beyond the mortal realm and delved into ideas of the afterlife. What happened after death was a mystery that early humans grappled with, but it was also something that fueled their imaginations and their spiritual practices. The concept of the afterlife became a central theme in many ancient cultures, and the beliefs surrounding it were as varied as the people who held them. Take, for instance, the ancient Egyptians. For them, death wasn't the end. It was just a transition to a different kind of existence. They believed in a rich, spiritual world that lay beyond the physical one, where the soul would continue its journey. The Egyptians practiced elaborate burial rituals, believing that if the deceased were properly prepared for the afterlife, they would be granted immortality. This belief gave rise to the monumental construction of tombs, like the Great Pyramids, which were designed to house the bodies of the dead and protect them in their journey to the next world. The elaborate rituals included not just physical preparations, but also the creation of spells, prayers, and offerings to appease the gods of the afterlife. The Book of the Dead is a famous example of this, a guide filled with incantations to protect the deceased from dangers they might encounter in the afterlife. Imagine it, the dead were not just buried and forgotten, they were sent on a journey that could take years or even centuries. The idea that life continued beyond death was comforting to the living, offering a sense of continuity even after the inevitable loss of loved ones. But Egypt wasn't alone in this belief. Across the ancient world, other cultures also had elaborate ideas about what awaited humans after death. The Mesopotamians, for example, believed in a shadowy underworld ruled by the god Ereshkigal. It wasn't a place of reward or punishment, just a dark, dreary realm where the souls of the dead wandered forever, in a state of existence that was neither fully alive nor fully dead. The ancient Greeks too believed in an afterlife, but their version was even more complex, with different regions of the underworld reserved for different kinds of souls, depending on how they lived their lives. Historians still debate the origins of these ideas. Were these beliefs simply a way to cope with the loss of loved ones? Or did they represent a deep-seated belief in the continuation of life beyond death? Some scholars argue that the development of afterlife beliefs was a natural consequence of the human need to make sense of death, while others believe these ideas were divinely inspired, passed down through a cultural or spiritual revelation. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but one thing is for sure: belief in the afterlife was an essential part of early human spirituality. The concept of the afterlife also reflected the evolving relationship between humans and their gods. No longer were humans just trying to appease the gods for material blessings or protection in the physical world. Now, the gods were seen as guiding figures who could help the living navigate the unknown realms of death. In many ways, the gods became the protectors of the soul, ensuring safe passage to the afterlife, or even determining whether someone deserved to enter it in the first place. This idea of divine judgment was an important aspect of many ancient cultures. In Egypt, for instance, the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was found to be pure, the soul was granted access to the paradise-like fields of reeds, where they could live in peace for eternity. If not, the soul would be devoured by Amit, a fearsome creature, and its existence would be erased forever. In this way, the afterlife wasn't just a continuation of life. It was a realm where moral decisions made during life had lasting consequences. In these early belief systems, death wasn't something to be feared. It was simply a new phase in a much larger spiritual journey. And while each culture had its own vision of the afterlife, one thing was clear. Humans were trying to understand death, not just as an end, but as a transformation, a continuation of something greater. As humans began to develop more structured societies, their beliefs about the spiritual world also became more elaborate and multifaceted. But one thing that remained constant was the reverence for the natural world, particularly animals. Animals were not just seen as creatures to be hunted or tamed. They were viewed as divine beings, spiritual messengers, and even embodiments of gods. This idea is known as totemism, a belief system in which certain animals are considered sacred and are believed to possess special powers or connections to the divine. As human civilizations flourished and grew more interconnected, another crucial aspect of their spiritual beliefs began to take shape: fire. It might seem simple now, but to the first humans, fire was nothing short of magical. It represented both creation and destruction, light and darkness, life and death. Fire was more than just a practical tool. It was a sacred element, a divine force with the power to transform everything it touched. And as societies began to develop more organized systems of belief, fire was woven deeply into the fabric of their spiritual practices. A fire was often seen as the very symbol of creation. It provided warmth and light, and it was through fire that early humans were able to cook food, which allowed them to evolve and survive. But fire also had a darker side. It was destructive, uncontrollable, and could wipe out entire villages in a single blaze. This dual nature made fire a powerful symbol in many ancient religions. It was the force that both sustained life and threatened it. And as such, it was revered and feared in equal measure. In ancient cultures, fire was often associated with the gods. The Greeks, for example, believed that Prometheus, one of the Titans, stole fire from the gods and gave it to humans, enabling them to progress and develop civilization. In Hinduism, fire is a sacred element that plays a central role in many rituals. The Agni, the fire god, was considered to be the mediator between humans and the gods, carrying offerings and prayers to the heavens. His rule of severity in Hindu fire was used in sacrifices and ceremonies, symbolizing the connection between the physical world and the divine. Historians still debate why fire became such a central element in early belief systems. Was it because fire represented both life and death, creation and destruction, that made it so powerful? Or was it simply because fire was so essential to survival that it took on a spiritual significance? Some argue that fire became symbolic of the divine because of its transformative power, how it could change raw materials into something else entirely, much like how spiritual rituals could change a person's fate or destiny. Whatever the reason, fire became a central symbol in many early belief systems, representing the power of the gods to shape and alter the world. But the symbolism of fire went even deeper. In many cultures, fire was also linked to the idea of purification. A common belief was that fire had the ability to cleanse and purify both the physical and spiritual realms. For example, in ancient Rome, it was believed that fire could purify the soul, and the practice of burning offerings to the gods was seen as a way to rid oneself of impurities. In many Native American cultures, fire was used in purification rituals, believed to burn away negative energy and promote spiritual renewal. Fire also represented the idea of divine presence. In many religious traditions, fire was used to symbolize the presence of a deity. For example, in the Hebrew Bible, God's presence is often associated with fire, whether it's the burning bush that Moses encounters or the fire that guides the Israelites through the desert. In many cases, fire was believed to be a manifestation of the divine on earth, and its presence was considered a sign of favor from the gods. As early civilizations grew, so did their rituals involving fire. In many cultures, fire was central to religious festivals and ceremonies. Festivals honoring the sun, harvest, or the changing seasons often involved elaborate fire rituals, where the gods were invited to join the humans around the flame. These rituals served to reinforce the connection between the divine and the mortal, helping humans feel as though they were part of something much larger than themselves. Historians still argue whether the widespread reverence for fire was driven more by its practical importance or its spiritual significance. Some suggest that fire's importance in early human life made it a natural candidate for spiritual reverence. Others believe that fire's deep symbolism, its connection to life, death, and transformation, made it a powerful force to represent the divine. Regardless of the exact reasons, fire became a cornerstone of early belief systems, one that would endure for millennia and continue to shape human spirituality. The symbolic role of fire in early belief systems wasn't just about worshipping a powerful element, it was about understanding the world through the lens of transformation. Fire could change things in an instant, and in the same way, belief systems could shape the fate of entire civilizations. As human societies evolved, so did their religious beliefs, especially when it came to the concept of death. While many early cultures shared a belief in the afterlife, the ways in which they approached death and the rituals surrounding it varied widely. But what remained constant across most ancient cultures was the idea that death was not an end, but a transition. And with this transition came the need for elaborate rituals to ensure the safe passage of the soul into the afterlife. One of the most well-known burial practices comes from the ancient Egyptians, who believed that death was merely the beginning of a journey into the afterlife. They didn't just bury their dead. They sent them off with everything they might need in the next world. Elaborate tombs, like the ones built for pharaohs, were filled with treasures, food, and even servants or representations of them to accompany the deceased. This wasn't just about luxury. It was about making sure the deceased had everything they needed for their journey into eternity. The Egyptians also believed in the weighing of the heart ceremony, where the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was found to be light and pure, the soul was allowed to enter the fields of reeds, a paradise where the deceased could live in peace. If the heart was heavy with sin, it would be devoured by the demon Amet, and the soul would be lost forever. The process of mummification was another part of this elaborate ritual, designed to preserve the body so that the soul could reunite with it in the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that if the body decayed, the soul would have no place to return to. In other cultures, death rituals were similarly elaborate, though the details varied. In Mesopotamia, for example, the dead were buried with food, tools, and other items to help them on their journey to the underworld. The Sumerians believed that the afterlife was a grim place, a dark and dusty underworld where the dead lived in a state of perpetual darkness. But even in this shadowy existence, rituals were still performed to honor the dead and ensure they had a place to rest. Like the Egyptians, the Sumerians believed that proper rituals could help the deceased avoid suffering in the afterlife. The ancient Greeks, on the other hand, had a different view of the afterlife. While they also believed in an underworld ruled by Hades, they didn't have the same elaborate burial practices as the Egyptians or Mesopotamians. Instead, the Greeks placed more emphasis on the ritual of the funeral and the offerings made to the gods to ensure that the deceased's soul was properly guided into the underworld. For the Greeks, the key to a peaceful afterlife was not just the rituals, but also the proper treatment of the body after death. The body had to be washed, dressed, and anointed with oils before burial, and the soul's journey into the afterlife was often marked by a procession to the tomb. Historians still debate the significance of death rituals in ancient cultures. Some argue that these rituals were essential to maintaining social order, offering a way for people to process grief and ensure the survival of their community's spiritual traditions. Others suggest that these death rituals were more about appeasing the gods and ensuring that the deceased could continue to influence the living. Regardless of the exact reason, one thing is clear: death was a significant event in early human life, and it required careful attention to ensure that the soul would continue its journey. These death rituals, elaborate as they were, reflect the early humans' understanding of life as a journey, one that extended far beyond the physical realm. For many ancient cultures, death was not an ending, but a transition to a new existence, one that required the same level of care and attention as life itself. These practices were not just about honoring the dead, they were about ensuring that the soul would continue its path, no matter what came after. As the ancient world continued to develop, so did the complexity of its spiritual beliefs. Alongside reverence for nature, ancestors, and the divine forces that controlled life and death, humans began to explore deeper concepts of morality, justice, and the role of divine intervention in their lives. These evolving spiritual frameworks set the stage for the development of sacred rituals and beliefs that would lay the foundation for many of the religious systems that would follow. One of the most fascinating aspects of early belief systems was the emergence of divine justice. In many ancient cultures, gods were not only seen as forces of creation, destruction, and protection, they also took on roles as moral arbiters, guiding the ethical conduct of their followers. Gods like the Egyptian Maat or the Mesopotamian Shamash represented justice, truth, and order. They were not just worshipped, they were also believed to hold individuals accountable for their actions, especially in the context of the afterlife. Take the Egyptians, for example. They had a detailed system of moral conduct known as Ma'at, which was essentially the concept of cosmic order, balance, and truth. It was embodied by the goddess Ma'at, who personified the idea that everything in the universe had a proper place and balance. To live according to Ma'at was to live in harmony with the world around you, ensuring justice, fairness, and truth. This idea permeated Egyptian society, influencing not only their spiritual practices, but their laws and social structures as well. The Egyptians believed that maintaining Ma'at was essential for both the individual and the society as a whole. In the afterlife, if a person had lived a life according to Ma'at, their soul would be deemed worthy to pass into the fields of reeds, where they could live eternally. If they had lived in opposition to Ma'at, their soul would face destruction. Similarly, in Mesopotamia, Shamash, the sun god, was also seen as a god of justice. The Babylonians believed that Shamash was the divine force that illuminated the world with truth, helping to reveal wrongdoings and guiding individuals toward righteousness. Shamash's role as a bringer of justice was so important that it extended beyond the divine realm and into the human realm. The Babylonians created codes of law, such as the famous Code of Hammurabi, which were inspired by the concept of divine justice. These laws were meant to reflect the principles of Shamash, ensuring that society was governed by fairness, equality, and divine order. As humans continued to refine their moral and ethical systems, the idea of divine judgment became even more ingrained in their spiritual beliefs. The idea that a divine being, or force, had the power to judge human actions and that this judgment had consequences in the afterlife became central to many religious systems. This belief laid the groundwork for the moral teachings of later religions, where concepts like sin, punishment, and divine favor would become central themes. Historians still debate whether the concept of divine justice was a reflection of social needs or whether it arose from genuine spiritual revelations. Some scholars suggest that these beliefs were a way to reinforce social order by linking personal actions to divine consequences. Others argue that divine justice was seen as a way to reconcile the apparent randomness of life, offering people a sense of comfort and security, knowing that their actions had lasting significance in the eyes of the gods. Regardless of its origins, the role of divine justice was a critical aspect of early belief systems. It not only influenced the way humans understood their place in the world, but also the way they related to the divine. Divine justice provided a moral framework that encouraged people to live virtuous lives, knowing that the gods were watching and that their actions would be weighed against the cosmic balance. It was a force that helped to shape early human civilization, reinforcing the idea that there were consequences for every action and that the universe itself was governed by a sense of order and fairness. As we look at the early beliefs of humanity, we see the beginnings of a moral system that would be carried forward into the development of major world religions. The notion of divine judgment, of gods who not only created and destroyed, but also upheld justice, would continue to resonate throughout history, influencing how people viewed their responsibilities to each other and to the divine. As human societies began to grow more complex, so too did their religious beliefs, particularly in their understanding of fertility and creation. Early human societies were heavily dependent on agriculture, and the cycles of life, death, and rebirth were intimately tied to the land. As a result, the worship of fertility gods and goddesses became a central part of many ancient religions, with these deities symbolizing the life-giving forces of nature and the fundamental cycles that govern both the earth and human existence. Fertility deities were revered as the key to ensuring abundance and prosperity. In agricultural societies, the success of crops was directly tied to divine favor, and as such, these gods and goddesses were considered essential for survival. One of the most well-known examples of a fertility deity is the ancient Sumerian goddess Inanna, who was later known as Ishtar in Babylonian culture. Inanna was not only a goddess of love and beauty, but also of fertility, sexuality, and war. Her myths often revolved around her journey to the underworld and her resurrection, symbolizing the agricultural cycles of planting, death, and rebirth. The Sumerians believed that Inanna's favor was necessary to ensure the fertility of the land, and her worship became deeply integrated into their agricultural practices. Similarly, in ancient Egypt, fertility was closely tied to the god Osiris. Osiris, often depicted as a mummified figure, represented death, resurrection, and the annual flooding of the Nile River, which brought life and fertility to the land. The Egyptians believed that Osiris's death and resurrection mirrored the cycles of agriculture, and they celebrated these cycles with grand festivals. The myth of Osiris, his death at the hands of his brother Set, and his subsequent resurrection by his wife Isis were seen as symbols of hope and renewal, reinforcing the belief that the land itself was alive and that its fertility was dependent on the divine. In many cultures, fertility deities were also linked to the changing seasons. The Greek goddess Demeter, for example, was the goddess of the harvest and agriculture. She was deeply connected to the cycles of planting and harvesting, and the myth of Demeter and her daughter Persephone explained the changing seasons. When Persephone was abducted by Hades to the underworld, Demeter's grief caused the earth to wither and become barren. When Persephone returned, Demeter's joy brought life and fertility back to the land. This myth, much like the stories of Inanna and Osiris, reinforced the idea that life and death, destruction and creation were all part of the same cycle, a cycle that was governed by the divine. Historians still debate whether the widespread worship of fertility deities was a direct reflection of the agricultural revolution, or if it was a more symbolic representation of human fertility. Some scholars suggest that the worship of fertility gods was a way for ancient peoples to understand and personify the forces of nature that were crucial to their survival. Others believe that the emphasis on fertility gods was an extension of earlier beliefs in the sacredness of the earth and the cycles of life. Whatever the reason, these deities became central to the lives of early humans, and their influence can still be seen in many modern religious practices and symbols. Fertility gods and goddesses didn't just represent the cycles of nature, they also symbolized the life force itself. In many cultures, the act of procreation was seen as sacred, and rituals surrounding fertility and reproduction were seen as ways to invoke divine blessings. For example, the ancient Romans held annual fertility festivals, such as the Feast of Ceres, where people would pray for an abundant harvest. In many African and Native American cultures, fertility rituals often involved offerings or sacrifices to ensure the continued fertility of the land and the people. The worship of fertility deities also played a role in shaping the social structures of early human societies. The need for abundant harvests and healthy populations led to the development of agricultural communities and the establishment of more complex social hierarchies. As societies became more organized, the roles of these deities expanded to include not only agricultural prosperity, but also the well-being of families and communities. Historians continue to argue whether the worship of fertility gods was primarily a religious response to the challenges of early agriculture, or if it was a broader reflection of humanity's connection to the natural world. Regardless of its origins, the worship of these deities was a crucial aspect of early spiritual systems, influencing everything from seasonal rituals to the structure of societies. The belief in divine fertility, in the power of nature to sustain life, was an essential part of early human life, and continues to echo in the religious practices of today. As human societies continued to evolve, so did their understanding of the divine and the role of ritual within their spiritual practices. One of the most significant developments in this regard was the practice of sacrifice. While the idea of offering something of value to the gods may seem strange to modern eyes, it was a central element of nearly every early civilization's religious system. Sacrifice wasn't just about giving away something material, it was about creating a bond with the divine, a way of offering thanks, asking for protection, or seeking favor in times of need. The types of sacrifices varied greatly from culture to culture. In ancient Egypt, for example, offerings of food, incense, and precious objects were made to the gods in temples. These offerings were intended to nourish the gods and ensure their favor. The Egyptians believed that the gods required sustenance, just like humans did, and the offerings were a way to maintain cosmic order and ensure that the divine forces would continue to support the living. In Mesopotamia, the practice of sacrifice was similarly focused on appeasing the gods and securing their favor. However, sacrifices in Mesopotamian cultures were often more elaborate and included the ritual slaughter of animals, such as goats or sheep. The Babylonians, for example, would sacrifice animals to gods like Marduk or Ishtar during religious festivals or in times of crisis, hoping that the sacrifice would bring about divine intervention or protection. Greeks too practiced animal sacrifices, but they also believed that the gods would accept a variety of offerings, including fruits, grains, and even wine. These sacrifices were often accompanied by prayers and rituals that were intended to honor the gods and ensure their continued favor. In fact, the Greeks believed that the gods enjoyed feasting on these sacrifices, and the act of giving back to the divine was seen as a way to maintain a harmonious relationship with the gods. In the case of the ancient Hebrews, sacrifice took on a different meaning. While animal sacrifices were practiced, they were also seen as a way to atone for sins. The Hebrew Bible describes how sacrifices could be made to cleanse individuals or the community from sin, restoring their relationship with God. This practice, known as atonement, was particularly important in the context of the Jewish Day of Atonement Yom Kippur, when sacrifices were offered to cleanse the sins of the people and bring them back into alignment with the divine will. Historians still debate the origins and significance of sacrifice in early religious systems. Some scholars argue that sacrifice was primarily a way of ensuring divine favor and securing prosperity, while others suggest that it was a way of communicating with the divine, creating a sense of connection between the human and the sacred. Still, others argue that sacrifice was a form of ritualistic exchange, where humans gave something of value to the gods in return for protection, blessings, or guidance. What remains clear, however, is that sacrifice was not a practice limited to any one culture. It was a universal aspect of early religions, found in the beliefs of peoples across the globe. It helped to define the relationship between humans and their gods, reinforcing the idea that the divine was not a distant force, but an active participant in the lives of the living. Sacrifice in all its forms was a way for early humans to honor, appease, and connect with the gods that shaped their world. The concept of sacrifice also reflected a deeper understanding of the world. Early humans believed that, in order to receive blessings, something had to be given in return. This exchange wasn't just about material things, it was about showing respect and acknowledging the power of the gods. In many ways, sacrifice was the ultimate act of devotion and trust. It was a way of saying, "We give to you, O divine forces, because we believe in your power and we trust that you will protect us and guide us." This exchange, rooted in the spiritual and material realms, formed the bedrock of many early human belief systems. As early human societies began to flourish, the complexity of their spiritual beliefs evolved as well. One of the most significant shifts was the movement toward monotheism, the belief in a single, all-powerful deity who ruled over all aspects of life. While polytheism had been the dominant religious structure in most ancient cultures, the idea of a single god or supreme deity began to emerge in certain civilizations. This shift marked a major turning point in the history of human spirituality, setting the stage for the rise of monotheistic religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. One of the earliest examples of monotheism can be found in ancient Egypt during the reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten. Akhenaten introduced the worship of Aten, the sun disk, as the one and only god. He ordered the closure of temples dedicated to other gods and encouraged his subjects to focus their devotion solely on Aten. This radical shift in religious practice was met with resistance, and after Akhenaten's death, the traditional polytheistic beliefs were restored. However, his brief attempt at monotheism demonstrated that the idea of a single god was not entirely alien to early human societies, even if it was short-lived. Similarly, in ancient Mesopotamia, the rise of monotheism was foreshadowed by the development of a supreme god in the Babylonian pantheon. Marduk, the god of the city of Babylon, rose to prominence and eventually became the chief god of the Babylonian Empire. While Marduk was part of a larger pantheon, his status as the head of the gods hinted at the eventual shift toward a singular, all-powerful deity. The idea of a supreme god who had control over all aspects of the universe was gaining traction, even in polytheistic cultures. But it was in ancient Israel that monotheism truly took root. The Hebrews were the first to fully embrace the belief in one God, Yahweh, who was not just the God of their people, but the creator and ruler of the entire universe. The Hebrew Bible, or Torah, recounts the story of how Yahweh chose the Israelites as his special people and made a covenant with them. This covenant required the Israelites to worship Yahweh alone and to follow his laws. Over time, the belief in Yahweh as the one true God spread beyond Israel, eventually giving rise to Christianity and later Islam, the largest monotheistic religions. Historians still debate the reasons behind the rise of monotheism. Some scholars argue that monotheism arose as a way to unite disparate tribes and peoples under a single, unifying deity. Others suggest that the shift was driven by philosophical or theological developments, such as the desire for a more abstract and all-encompassing concept of God. Still, others believe that monotheism was a natural evolution of the spiritual ideas that had emerged in earlier culture. In any case, the rise of monotheism represented a major shift in human spirituality, one that would influence religious thought and practice for millennia to come. The development of monotheism also brought about changes in the way humans understood their relationship with the divine. In polytheistic religions, gods were often seen as distant and capricious beings whose favor had to be won through ritual and sacrifice. But in monotheism, God was often seen as personal, deeply involved in the lives of believers. The idea that there was only one God who created the universe and who was concerned with the moral conduct of humanity had a profound impact on religious ethics. It placed a greater emphasis on concepts like justice, mercy, and morality, as believers were expected to live according to the will of this one all-powerful deity. As monotheism spread, it gradually replaced polytheism in many parts of the world. The rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire, followed by the spread of Islam across the Middle East and North Africa, solidified the dominance of monotheistic religions in the Western world. These religions, though diverse in their beliefs and practices, shared a common understanding of a single, all-powerful God who governed the universe and demanded worship and obedience from his followers. Historians still debate the impact of monotheism on the development of human civilization. Some argue that monotheism helped to unify diverse cultures and provide a more cohesive moral framework. Others suggest that the rise of monotheism contributed to the development of more centralized political systems, as religious authority became closely tied to political power. Whatever the case may be, monotheism has left a lasting legacy on human spirituality, shaping the religious, philosophical, and ethical systems of much of the world. As the concept of monotheism began to take hold and shape the spiritual landscapes of the ancient world, another intriguing development emerged in the human quest for understanding: the creation myths. Every culture had its own explanation for how the world came to be, each reflecting the values, fears, and aspirations of the people who created them. These myths weren't just stories. They were foundational to the way early humans viewed the universe, their place within it, and the divine forces that governed their lives. Creation myths provided answers to some of life's most fundamental questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? How did the world come into existence? One of the most famous creation myths comes from ancient Mesopotamia, the Enuma Elish. This Babylonian creation myth tells the story of how the world was created from the chaos of a primordial sea. The gods emerged from this chaotic water, and through a series of battles and divine struggles, the world was formed. In this myth, the god Marduk, after defeating the goddess Tiamat, used her body to create the heavens and the earth. The Enuma Elish not only explained the origins of the world, but also affirmed the supremacy of Marduk, reinforcing his role as the king of the gods and the ruler of the universe. Similarly, the ancient Egyptians had their own creation myth, which was centered around the god Atum. According to Egyptian belief, Atum created the world from the chaotic waters of Nun, the primordial ocean. Atum then gave birth to the first gods, who in turn created the earth and everything on it. The Egyptians viewed creation as a cyclical process. Just as the sun rose each day, so too did the world continue to be reborn. This myth reflected the Egyptians' understanding of the natural world, especially the cycles of the sun, the Nile River, and the agricultural seasons. In ancient Greece, the creation myth was filled with gods, titans, and cosmic battles. The Greeks believed that in the beginning there was chaos, a void or nothingness. From this void, the first primordial beings emerged, including Gaia, Earth, and Uranus, sky. The Greek myth of creation also features the titan Cronus, who overthrew his father Uranus, only to be overthrown by his own son Zeus. The story of the Greek gods and their battles was a reflection of the Greeks' understanding of the world's natural order, with gods representing forces of nature, human emotions, and abstract concepts. But the most lasting and influential creation myth, especially in the context of monotheism, comes from the Hebrew Bible. The book of Genesis outlines the creation of the world in a more structured, orderly manner than the chaotic, battlefield stories of other cultures. According to Genesis, God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, with each day bringing a new aspect of creation: light, sky, land, animals, and finally, humans. This creation myth became the foundation for Jewish, Christian, and Islamic beliefs, deeply shaping the spiritual and moral outlook of billions of people throughout history. Historians still argue whether creation myths were primarily intended to explain the origins of the world, or if they were more about reinforcing the social and cultural values of a particular society. Some scholars suggest that creation myths were an attempt to give people a sense of order in a chaotic world, providing a framework for understanding their environment and their relationship to the divine. Others believe that creation myths were more about justifying the power of kings or gods, legitimizing their rule by linking their authority to the creation of the world itself. Regardless of their exact purpose, creation myths served an essential function in early belief systems. They helped people make sense of their existence, offering explanations for the mysteries of the natural world. And just as importantly, they provided a shared narrative that united people within a culture or community, binding them together through a common understanding of their origins. The stories of creation, whether chaotic or orderly, divine or human, laid the groundwork for the religious and philosophical systems that would emerge in the centuries to come. They offered a glimpse into the minds of early humans, revealing their need to understand the forces at work in the world and their place within it. And as these creation myths were passed down through generations, they became more than just stories. They became part of the very fabric of human culture, shaping the spiritual, ethical, and moral systems that continue to influence us today. As we approach the final chapter of this journey through early human beliefs, it's important to reflect on the lasting impact of these foundational ideas on modern spirituality and religious practice. The ancient beliefs that once shaped the lives of early humans are not just distant relics of the past. They still influence the way we think about the world today. From the way we understand the divine to the rituals that continue to bind us together, the echoes of early human spirituality can be seen in nearly every religion that has followed. While many of the specific beliefs of ancient civilizations have faded away, their core ideas have endured. The concept of a divine, guiding force, whether it's a pantheon of gods or a singular god, remains a central tenet of many modern religions. The worship of nature, the reverence for ancestors, and the belief in a cosmic balance are ideas that still resonate with people around the world. The ancient practice of sacrifice, once a central part of religious rituals, may no longer involve the literal offering of animals, but the idea of giving something meaningful to the divine, whether it's time, devotion, or resources, continues to shape spiritual practices in countless cultures. Even the ancient quest for answers to life's biggest questions, the nature of creation, the purpose of existence, and the fate of the soul, continues to drive philosophical and theological debates to this day. The stories of gods, spirits, and heroes that once filled the minds of early humans are now written into the sacred texts of the world's major religions, where they serve as guides for living a righteous life. And while the details of the myths may differ, the underlying themes remain strikingly similar: the search for meaning, the desire for justice, and the hope for eternal life. But perhaps one of the most powerful legacies of early human beliefs is the enduring human connection to the spiritual realm. Across cultures and time periods, people have sought to understand the divine through prayer, ritual, and storytelling. Whether it's through the careful observation of nature or the deep introspection of personal spirituality, the pursuit of a connection with something greater than oneself remains a fundamental part of what it means to be human. And while the forms and expressions of spirituality may have changed over millennia, the desire to understand the mysteries of the universe has not wavered. As we look back at the ancient belief systems that once governed human life, it's clear that these early spiritual practices were not just attempts to explain the world. They were a way for people to find meaning and connection in an otherwise chaotic and unpredictable existence. The first humans didn't have the luxury of scientific knowledge or modern conveniences. But what they did have was an unshakable belief that the world was full of forces greater than themselves. forces that needed to be understood, respected, and appeased. Their beliefs allowed them to navigate the mysteries of life and death, to make sense of the chaos around them, and to build communities bound by shared spiritual practices. As you close your eyes tonight, remember that the very act of believing, whether in gods, spirits, or the unseen forces of nature, was born from a deeply human need to find comfort, purpose, and connection. These early spiritual practices, born out of necessity, continue to shape our understanding of the world and our place in it. And as you drift off into sleep, you might find comfort in knowing that these ancient beliefs, passed down through generations, still live on in the way we understand ourselves and the universe around us.